Raed Ahmed carried Iraq's flag into the 1996 Olympics opening ceremony at Atlanta, and then he defected. Olympic Stories this morning in half an hour tells the weightlifter's story. But now Evan Davis continues his exploration of one of the most contested changes in education since the Second World War, the rise of the comprehensive school. Comp.
I haven't seen it for years. I haven't seen the school for years.
That was a new building when you went there, is that right? It was a sort of spanking clean building?
It still looks quite good, doesn't it? What's the first thing you notice? It's all glass.
In 1960, in London, in what was then the run-down neighbourhood of Islington, a new comprehensive school was created, Rising Hill. It was about the 150th comprehensive in England and Wales. A new kind of school, and Rising Hill had a new kind of liberal ethos. I revisited the site with one of the first pupils, Bob Crane, who had found it an extraordinary change from his previous school.
My old secondary modern school was fiercely disciplinarian. The maths teacher would make you stand up and say a particular times table, and you'd get 3/4 of the way through it, stumble if you didn't know, forget it, and he'd go, right, stand to the back of the class. End of the class, you got the cane.
And then you got to Rising Hill, and what was that like?
We were told there was no corporal punishment. Originally there was no detention. It was a completely free environment.
As Rising Hill demonstrated, in the new decade of the 60s, nothing was going to be untouched by the new mood, certainly not education. At the beginning of the 60s, comprehensives were unusual and experimental. By the end of the 60s, they were national policy. In Scotland, the whole structure and debate about education was different, but in England and Wales, this was the decade the word comprehensive caught on, the decade of Anthony Crosland creating comps and causing controversy. But the comprehensive decade got off to an inauspicious start, with the rise and fall of Rising Hill. Chris Courtney was among the new first years there.
The school was sold to my parents by the headmistress of the junior school as a new type of schooling. This is the modern thing. When we went there, it was a modern school, modern buildings, modern facilities. This is a brave new world, comprehensive education. He's failed 11 plus. Perhaps he'll get a chance later in life. A comprehensive school is the thing for him.
Until now, most comprehensives had adopted a grammar ethos with gowns for teachers, uniforms for children, and no running in the corridor. Rising Hill was different. Yvonne Castro, then 11, was entranced by it all.
It was like a great big outing. It was a big fun environment. Everybody seemed to be walking around aimlessly. Nobody used to walk around with books. You know, they'd be looking for their books. They'd be finding their books at the bottom of the staircase. Or it was pandemonium, really, I think, to be honest. And most days you'd be looking around for your classroom and you'd find it very late and then you'd get in there, but no one would tell you off. And that was the one big thing that stuck out in my mind for the whole of my period there. No one ever made you feel bad.
But it was not for everybody. Yvonne Fisher found all that freedom was almost oppressive.
I was terrified, absolutely terrified. I think it was the complete turnaround of the adult-child relationship. It was a complete turnaround. I mean, I didn't even make eye contact with my last headmaster. It was frightening. It was like all your boundaries had gone and you were falling because there was no system to stop you.
The leader of the revolution that Rising Hill represented was actually an ex-tank major in the British Army, Michael Duane. His non-judgmental approach to children is a cliché of the 60s now, but his rejection of corporal punishment has become the norm. It was certainly captivating at the time. Bob Dixon, teaching English in a grammar school in another part of London, decided he wanted to sign up.
It was quite a big shock coming from a grammar school, and even though I taught in the East End, because in the East End the pupils had been battered into submission.
You make it sound rather easy, Mr. Duane, as though a little chat in the headmaster's study will cure bad language, insolence, as well as physical violence.
I'm quite satisfied now that the infliction of pain or fear is not in any sense an educational measure which benefits this child.
We'd all come from severe backgrounds. The kids were poor, some of the kids had come from violent homes, and we were going into this environment where Mike Duane wanted self-discipline, and it was something we hadn't had to practice before.
during that first year there were a lot of school fights.
Bob Jeffries was a pupil at the time.
Knives and
I remember
people being slashed.
I can remember the chain
cutthroat
fight.
racer.
Yeah,
chain
I remember a
fight.
girl's hair being set on fire by a boy in the desk behind, a teacher being shot.
Yeah,
with
pretty
an air
accurate
gun.
sort of stuff, really.
Ambulances being called, people getting thrown out of windows.
Yeah. It was, letting loose the mob. It was too sudden a change.
Rising Hill's great leap forwards had landed it in trouble. There was even dissent among the staff, some of whom felt disarmed by the prohibition on corporal punishment.
I'm sorry to say that all my colleagues at Rising Hill did not go along with the policy, and some corporal punishment went on surreptitiously. And I'm sorry to say also that I once struck a pupil. I'd lost my temper and I did that.
There have been fights of one sort and another here at Rising Hill ever since it was opened in 1960.
Rising Hill's problems reached the authorities, the press and the BBC.
The staff has fought with courage to overcome an environment as hostile to education as any in Britain.
Barry Cook, a pupil at the time.
I can remember it being front page news over a considerable amount of time. And I can remember that the politics that were being made was, because this school has failed, comprehensive systems have failed. The politicians that wanted to see the end of that kind of education weren't looking at the education needs, they were looking at the school and using the school as a scapegoat for the comprehensive system.
The London County Council said enough was enough.
By the end of the 4 or 5 years that the school was open, there weren't anywhere near the same level of violence. There were kids that were beginning to do well. I think one child even got into university, which for the area was quite remarkable. But by then the political situation had changed and they put the kibosh on the school. They wanted to use it as an example of why social education of that sort doesn't work.
In the summer of 1965, the school was closed amid controversy and parental protest. But Rising Hill's premature death only acted to enshrine its iconic status among liberal educationalists. The council said it was killed off because roles had fallen and the site was needed for another school. But there was an altogether smarter conspiracy theory. It said the recalcitrant Rising Hill had to be shut down because it was giving comprehensive schools a bad name. It was endangering the real comprehensive revolution, which was about to start now. The great irony is that just as it closed down, comps were on their way, and they were more than just an educational reform in the 60s, they were a quintessentially 60s education reform. Stuart Maclure was then one of the country's leading educational journalists.
Very few major changes happen in English education for educational reasons. It was the political and social force which put a strength behind the comprehensive elbow.
We're trying to get rid of something that's become an absolute curse to children in this country. We're getting rid of the 11+.
The man who was going to overthrow the selective education system was Anthony Crosland, who became Secretary of State for Education in 1965.
I think today almost all parents agree with us that selection is bad, it's a chancy business, and it's unjust.
Crosland was a Labour ideologue. He was high class and highbrow. In his book The Future of Socialism in 1956, he advocated a more egalitarian society, with egalitarian schools as a weapon against capitalism. Stuart Maclure.
I think he was not particularly concerned about the curriculum. There was nothing in what he did about the curriculum. And I think he just wanted a change in organisation because he thought it would be better. That in fact there might be a more homogeneous society if all children were educated side by side. I think this was a real piece of idealism. I don't think there's much evidence to show that it would be true, but nevertheless it was a powerful ideal.
One of the lessons I think Tony Crosland tried to teach the Labour Party,
Roy Hattersley was then a young MP,
is that we shouldn't be afraid of saying, whilst we want comprehensive schools to benefit that 80% of the previously neglected population, we also want them because they help to produce our vision of society. People say, oh, the Labour Party wanted comprehensive schools because they're social engineers. Well, my God, our opponents want public schools because they're social engineers. You can't have a view on the education system without relating it to your view of society, and we ought not to be ashamed that comprehensives relate to the more equal society.
Labour promised a grammar school education for all. It was to be a levelling up, not down. And now was the time for Anthony Crosland to unleash comps throughout England and Wales.
We propose in a few weeks' time from now to send out a circular to local authorities calling on them to introduce comprehensive schemes, but of course this...
The Crosland Circular was to become the Magna Carta of comprehensive education. It was drawn up in July 1965 and was numbered 1065. For the first time, comprehensives were national policy. There was one small snag, however. National governments didn't run education policy, it was local authorities who did that. So Crosland had to tread carefully. Within Whitehall, a debate occurred about how forcefully to proceed in imposing comprehensives. And in the end, the argument boiled down to which of two dangerously similar-sounding words should be inserted into the first paragraph of the circular.
There was a discussion as to whether it should have been a matter of requiring local authorities to go comprehensive or simply requesting them. The local authorities told him he should request them and actually doubted if he had the powers to require them. And they weren't actually prepared to legislate and take those powers because they wanted to get on with it.
Request or require. 3 letters different, but one means compulsory, one means voluntary. The problem was that if you request something of somebody, they can, of course, say no. For pro-comp campaigners, Crosland's vacillation was alarming. Clyde Chitty was a member of the Comprehensive Schools Committee.
Those of us campaigning at the time wanted it to be required rather than requested because we felt that it gave too much autonomy to local authorities who may be recalcitrant and therefore decided they just didn't want to go along with the government policy. We have to accept that we failed on that, and then after failing on that, our main concern was to show by our monitoring of comprehensive developments that Crosland's idea that everybody would respond in a positive way to the request of the department, that wasn't borne out by the facts.
But the comps didn't just have national government on their side. They had money. So while in theory education authorities could ignore the request to go comprehensive, if any of them needed cash for new school buildings, the cheque had to be signed by a certain A. Crosland. And guess what? He would only pick up the bill for a certain type of school, as Chris Price, who became Parliamentary Private Secretary to Crosland, explains.
The birth rate bulge was at this point coming out of the primary schools into the secondary schools, and we were raising the school leaving age from 15 to 16. And the combination of those two facts meant that local council couldn't exist without great dollops of capital money from the government. And Tony Crosland, in local authority after local authority, traded cash for comprehensives. He said to Surrey, who had a very fast-growing population in Surrey, just build your first comprehensive school and you'll have so much, and then you build another comprehensive school, you have a bit more. And so that's why all these counties went comprehensive. They were quite happy to go comprehensive.
And so the author of The Future...
So it would be reported to them that Lincolnshire Education Committee was considering a plan for 1 or 2 comprehensive schools. So they would issue a press release, Lincolnshire goes comprehensive. Now, it still hasn't gone comprehensive to this day, but the press release is poured out as though the tide was flowing at a far faster rate than it actually was.
Within a few years, the majority of children will be educated in comprehensive schools. It's a place of social as well as educational reform.
We make no apology for going back to the problem of the comprehensive schools and the grammar schools for the second time this week in the BBC's Current Affairs Programme.
Secondary education is to go all comprehensive, with grammar schools disappearing as separate institutions.
With comps on their way, the egalitarian spirit of the 60s now even trickled up to the cabinet. Couldn't they send their children to comps? For the first time, public figures' private decisions now became the litmus test of their commitment to the comprehensive cause. No one saw this more closely than Susan Crosland, Anthony Crosland's second wife. She had 2 children from her previous marriage.
They were not Tony's children, and I didn't want decisions on their lives to be taken for political purposes. But he was very cunning, and at Sunday lunch, he and Sheila, my elder daughter, he would discuss with Sheila the point of the comprehensive schools. And after, I suppose, a year, of these Sunday lunches, Sheila announced one day that she wanted to go to a comprehensive.
It sounds like within the family, his policy of requesting rather than requiring worked rather well in the end.
That's very shrewd of you. Yes, it was.
Further along the front bench, Tony Benn decided to send his young children to the same school as the Croslands, pulling them out of private schools. Holland Park Comprehensive achieved notoriety as the school for Cabinet Minister's offspring. Melissa Benn remembers all the attention she got there.
It is amazing the sort of pressure and panic and anxiety that their peer group put on my parents when they decided to move us, and letters from very eminent people that I won't name saying, how could you sacrifice your children in this way, and terrible things will happen, and lots of discussions within the wider family. And I have to hand it to my parents. They just said, we're going to do this. We think it's absolutely right. There was always a sense when I was growing up that this was a positive, great thing to do.
Did people say things in private to you, your siblings?
Oh, endlessly. I mean, the number of times people say, oh, where did you go to school, or where did you go to school? And I say, oh, I go to Holland Park. And they go, isn't that where that mad wedgie bends? And I used to say, yeah, probably. I think it is, because I'm one of them.
But would anyone stop or even reverse Crosland's slow comprehensive creep? Presumably the Conservative opposition were opposing it. Well, not quite. Some Conservative local authorities did refuse to abolish the old system, and they retain grammar schools to this day. But the Etonian old guard at the top of the party were caught off guard when educational reform moved rapidly up the political agenda. Christopher Chataway was a relatively newly elected MP in the Conservative government of the early 1960s.
When Alec Douglas-Home became Prime Minister, Nigel Lawson and I prepared the Prime Minister for his first major interview. And so we thought up the questions that he was likely to be asked. And I remember putting to him the question, and Prime Minister, are you in favour of the 11 plus? And he stopped and he said, surely that's not a question they're going to ask a Prime Minister.
The Tory party was changing, though. A younger breed was getting through. Would they put their energies into stopping Crosland and supporting the old grammar schools? They might have done if all of them had supported the old grammar schools, but some of the younger Conservatives were themselves disillusioned with the 11 plus. Christopher Chataway had his own moment of revelation when he became a junior education minister. His job was to adjudicate on those who were appealing against failure.
I remember a number of the letters which were simply appalling. You would see a father who'd written in on an appeal saying, I had always hoped that my son was going to be a solicitor or a doctor, but I now realise as a result of this exam that he's going to be pushing a dust cart like me. And I must say, looking at those week in, week out, first made me wonder whether selecting children between sheep and goats at the age of 10 and a half was a very good idea.
For some Tories in the one nation tradition, the comprehensive one school idea was worth considering.
I believe there is a very wide measure of opinion in this country, including a great deal of Conservative opinion, which is not happy about selection into separate schools at the age of 11, which believes, I'm sure I dare to say,
Sir Edward Boyle, who had been minister early in the 60s, had actually come to the conclusion that there ought to be more comprehensive schools and a bigger commitment to try them out and see how they were going to work.
So some Conservatives were minded to support comprehensive schools, and the Labour government was keen to introduce them. But that didn't mean there wasn't going to be a fight. Whatever the national politicians were saying, the barricades went up in locality after locality as individual schools were marked for reform. If the parents of Rising Hill had protested when that school closed, what kind of backlash would you get when ancient grammars were given the death sentence?
Well, in time, I'm sure it'll kill the grammar school as it is today. Now, these grammar schools have existed for hundreds of years.
I think the whole plan is an affront to freedom. This scheme is being pushed down our throats.
Bristol was just one city which saw a local rebellion against plans to draw the grammars into the comprehensive system.
It'll happen here to Colston's Girls' School. Now, that school, they're going to draw on the immediate neighbourhood and bring in boys and girls from an area which normally contributes only a small proportion of grammar school material. Now, I'm no snob, but in my opinion, this is a bad thing.
Colston's Girls' Grammar in inner city Bristol was told that its future was as a mixed, comprehensive, an alarming prospect for its students and their parents. Helen Dunn was headmistress back then.
Yes, there was anger, and there were these public demonstrations against the whole idea of destroying a school which, by the standards of the time, was providing what was asked for. I did see the prospect of a flourishing school looking after academic pupils. I did see the end of that as a disaster.
At the time, some 40 years ago, she was more diplomatic in her language about the proposed change.
In the short-term plan, it will mean that we have fewer girls, probably, and certainly girls of a different ability.
Wally Jenkins was Labour leader of the council when the plans were made.
We took the view, and when comprehensive education started to take root and began to develop, that was our goal. We were aiming to make Bristol a comprehensive education setup.
It was a hard and a bitter fight, and as far as local opinion went, there were no gloves on.
All the grammar schools got organised, the placards were made, the drums were banged, the marches were started, so that the thing became out of full proportion to what the real debate was. The real debate was, you cannot sort at 11 years of age the sheep from the goats.
And so, a new national pastime was born, arguing about comprehensives. Even Bristol's youngsters were drawn in. Barry Hunt was then a teenager.
We knew the debate was going on because there was a lot of talk about the school I was in, being Bristol Cathedral School. We were being linked up with St Mary Redcliffe Boys' School, which was a secondary modern school at that particular time. Because we regarded secondary moderns as being very inferior, and the students who went to secondary moderns, we used to call them oiks, it seemed that this was not something that we would like to do. It would almost seem like an infiltration, a taking over.
Bristol was simply one example of a local debate, but it took no time for the local debates to become a national phenomenon.
Just a moment, no, the gentleman over there. Just a moment, one at a time.
In 1965, Robin Day struggled to hold order on Panorama when Anthony Crosland faced the public.
You said I was fooling about and mucking about with the educational system.
I believe very strongly in comprehensive education.
I hope the Minister won't feel I'm being offensive, but I feel that he's been allowed to get away with a certain amount of almost hypocritical talk.
If he is offensive to the Minister, the Minister...
It was becoming clear there would be no easy ride for advocates of comprehensives. Encountering passion and ill feeling were occupational hazards. Christopher Chataway went on to run the Inner London Education Authority.
I would go to public meetings of parents and teachers at these schools in order to try to argue the case, and a lot of those meetings, were very rough and very emotional. I've met in subsequent years some of the people who've been involved. There's a man who was at Sloane Grammar School. He tells me that there was a public meeting which I defended the proposition to amalgamate Sloane, a boys' grammar school, Carlisle, a girls' grammar school, and 4 secondary moderns to create the Pimlico Comprehensive. I realised from talking to him that all these things were a great deal more complicated than they necessarily seemed to us at the time. And his father, who's still alive and was at the public meeting where I defended the proposition, has never forgiven me.
Many have never forgiven Anthony Crosland either. He was Education Secretary for only 2.5 years between 1965 and 1967, but he'd embarked on making the biggest change to schools for a generation and had created one of the most enduring national controversies.
Oh yes. Oh yes. Of course it's clear. It is government policy to end selection at 11+, non-selective secondary education period.
There is a small epilogue to these events, however. In 1982, a decade and a half on, and 5 years after Anthony Crosland's death, his widow Susan wrote a memoir of her late husband. Buried in its pages, she reported on one short conversation she'd had with him late one night in 1965. A single remark that she attributed to him, containing a strong expletive, came to haunt the debate over comprehensive schools. Did it shed new light on the real motives of the man who took the country comprehensive? You'll have to pardon the language.
When he came home late from the House of Commons, he was in an absolutely filthy mood because of the battles he'd been having all day in the department. And what he said was, "It was the last thing I do. I'm going to destroy every fucking grammar school in England and in Wales." And I said, "Why not in Scotland?" And he said, "Because the Scots have their own Secretary of State." And then he began to laugh.
Roy Hattersley, though, thinks it's no laughing matter.
Nothing has done so much damage to Tony's memory, or done so much damage to the comprehensive cause. Tony was, above all other things, an intellectual, and that simple sentence, hardly representative of one non-selective education. I'm very doubtful if Tony ever said that. If he said it, he didn't mean it in the way that it appears in Susan's book.
Well, I was the one who was there, and I think Roy is mistaken on this.
I suppose the way in which half the world interprets it is that really what was going on in this reform of education was bitterness and anger against what other people had, and it wasn't about creating something new, it was about destroying something old.
Oh, the correct interpretation is it was an explosive remark made when he was absolutely fed up with his workday. I got awfully tired of hearing it quoted back as if it was a thought-out, considered attitude instead of an irritable ejaculation.
By 1968, 1/5 of secondary pupils were in comprehensive schools, and year by year the total was growing. To quote one civil servant, the great push had taken place. But as we'll be hearing in the next programme, in the 1970s, it was what went on in the classroom that would matter. Had we provided a grammar school education for all, or simply forced everyone into a secondary modern?
You can hear that programme again tonight at 9:30. Comp was presented by Evan Davis and produced by Matthew Dodd. Now for this morning's Olympic story. Athletes in Saddam Hussein's Iraq rarely defected, as their families would be punished. Yet in 1996, the weightlifter, who'd been Iraq's flag bearer at Atlanta's opening ceremony, fled the athletes' village and appealed for asylum. The British Olympian Diane Modal tells his story, which we first broadcast in 2004.
From 1984 until last year, Iraqi Olympic sport was under the control of Uday Hussein. Athletes who didn't perform would be shaved, beaten and sometimes imprisoned. Throughout the 90s, there were calls for the Iraqi team to be banned from the Olympics. They still competed. It was only when the war began last year that the Iraqi Olympic Committee's membership of the IOC was suspended. Since the fall of Saddam, sport has been a priority for the new authorities there, so much so that the first democratic elections held in Iraq were for the committees of new sports federations. It's a democratic process that led to the newly elected National Olympic Committee for Iraq being recognised by the IOC.
We are proud that election beginning in the sport before any branch of election for parliament.
Hussein Hayat Mohammed is president of the Iraqi Football Association. As a player, he competed in 3 Olympic Games, in 80, 84 and 88. He's now a vice president of the Iraqi Olympic Committee and says Iraqi athletes have a new competitive edge.
Now our players and our coach want to do the best for the Iraqi. They participate and they practice under very difficult situation, without electric in the summer and without grass, without anything, equipment is ready. They do the best, they improve themselves, and now we working to rebuilding sport with a good vision and with a new vision, and I think the future is for Iraq sport.
There's all Iraqi teams right here. There's Muhammad Tahir, Raid Ahmed, Abdullah Isa. This is Iraqi teams right here. Saddam Championship. You know, here I'm the best player in Iraq in 1987. That one is snatch, you know. 160. She's big muscle.
As he flicks through old photos, Raid Ahmed fondly remembers competing for Iraq in the 80s and 90s.
This is my coach. This guy from Mosul, and this coach from Baghdad, and this is Raid Ahmed. You know, Uday, he sent, you know, this coach, he sent him to jail about a couple months, in 98. Yeah, he was in Turkish with the, you know, small championship, and he didn't bring medals. He sent him to jail.
Tales abounded of Iraqis being tortured and jailed for failing to achieve sporting success. Back in the early 90s, Raid frequently competed abroad, but he grew increasingly unhappy with how sport was treated under Saddam's regime. Just as other political leaders have done before, the Husseins used sport to promote themselves.
For example, everybody know about Maradona. Maradona, he's play soccer, you know. Any people, if you want to go ask in Iraq, they know about Maradona, but nobody knows who's the president for Argentina. So that's why Saddam, he bring his son and put in the Olympic community, not for the people, for him. Today Saddam, he don't care about athletes, you know. Before in 1980, we got everything the best, you know, in Iraq. Weightlifting, boxer, you know, soccer team. Saddam's sons came to Olympic community, and he's president for Olympic. As everybody's gone after 2 years, because everybody's scared, you know. When you want to go to competition, he gonna tell you if you wanna don't bring medals, maybe they gonna send you to jail. In Olympic community, they make a meeting, you know, big meeting before you came. They gonna, you know, tell you you gonna bring medals or not. I tell them no. Maybe I bring, maybe not. So if you like it, I go. If you don't like it, I'm gonna stay. So that's why I don't have a problem with Uday. But some people, before he came here, he don't know what's going on outside. They tell me, yeah, I'm gonna bring a medal. They tell him, okay. Hey, listen, when you didn't bring any medals, I'm gonna send you to jail. They tell him, okay, go to sign it. And he signed it. I tell him, how come you to sign paper, you don't know what's going on outside? So that's why when they came back, they sent him to jail and shave here everything and pay money too.
Like many experienced Iraqi sportsmen, Raid learnt never to say he expected to do well. He was so trusted by Uday, Raid was chosen to carry his country's flag into the Atlanta Olympic Stadium in 1996.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the opening ceremony of the Games of the 26th Olympiad, the Centennial Olympic Games.
Georgia, Georgia.
In Olympic, they ask, you know, the manager for Iraqi team. They tell him who the best guy in Iraq. They say Raid Ahmed, he's the best guy. That's okay. They give me a flag, and after a couple of days, I stay here.
Still under UN sanctions, of course, but the theme here is inclusion. No political judgments drawn. They have to march in behind Iran. The nation Iraq fought for 8 years, starting.
The general manager, he told me when you go walk, don't look for the president. Maybe Saddam, he don't like that. But I don't care about him. When I walk, I look for him, and I'm very happy when I see him now. This is president for United States, and he's very happy when he sees Iraqi teams. And everybody knows United States got a problem with Saddam Hussein, but they don't care about the world because this is athlete, you know, that's different.
I declare open the Games of Atlanta, celebrating the 26th Olympiad of the modern era.
And then when I go to immigration service, they tell me no problem. If you want to stay, stay. This country free.
Iraqi weightlifter Raid Ahmed dashed out of Atlanta's Olympic Village yesterday, jumped into a waiting car, and sped off to start a new life in the United States. Ahmed carried his country's flag in the opening ceremonies of the Olympics, but was planning even then to ask for asylum when the opportunity presented itself. NPR's Ted Clark reports.
Raid Ahmed defected with the help of friends and the Iraqi National Congress, an opposition group based in London. Ahmed is a Shia from southern Iraq.
والله أنا أشعر أكو أمل يعني في بقائي هنا واستقراري والأمن على الحفاظ عليه ومع ذلك هم خايف على عائلتي موجودة في العراق.
He said, I feel hopeful of staying here. I feel I'm very secure staying here in this country, but at the same time, I'm very much worried about my family.
I bring, the phone number from Iraq. When I got time, I called my friend. I like to stay here. He told me this is very difficult, it's not easy. Be careful because I got father and mother, brother and sister in Iraq. I told him, I don't care, but, I like just to stay. And then I think about my family.
And Raid had reason to be concerned about how Uday Hussein would react to his move. Abbas al-Janabi was Uday's PR man back in '96 and spokesman for the Iraqi Olympic Committee. He was in Baghdad when news of Raid's decision to stay in America broke.
When we hear about this, about his being defected to the States, I remember the first reaction of Uday. He was very nervous and he ordered one of his bodyguards to bring Raid family to the Olympic Committee. I mean the family, the mother, the father, the wives, and the children, everybody. And he threatened that if he will not come, he's going to execute all his family.
They like to tell me, your father and mother in Olympic community. So if he didn't go back, maybe I'm going to kill him, Kill your wife, or your sister, or your mother. I told him I don't care, but I don't. I told him I don't care because if I tell him I care about my family, they're going to kill everybody.
Raid treated it very bravely when he said to him that he doesn't care for his family. He wants to divorce his wife. His father has nothing to do with him. He is independent, so he treated it like this. And this was successful. And, there is no benefit in killing people, because he decided and they realized that this man will never come back.
Remarkably, Raid's family did escape with their lives. They handed over a substantial amount of money and left jail 2 weeks later. Almost constant surveillance followed for the next 7 years. Raid's wife was forced to denounce her husband, but managed to escape Iraq, and now the couple live with their 4 young children in a Detroit suburb. Raid's a hard-working car salesman now, and can even afford to joke about how tough living the American dream has proved to be.
If I know before, after Olympic, I will quit and go to work every day and 7 days a week, I'm not stay here. Maybe I go to Europe, I work 7 days. I see my family just a couple hours or 3 hours, that's it, every day.
One thing Raid doesn't joke about is having been an Olympian.
When I watch that, I'm very, very happy when I see, because now my wife and my son and my daughter, they watch, when I see that, I wish one more time, I go to try work out and go to Olympic. I'm very lucky when I was there. Because now when I watch, I don't believe I be there, 1996. See, as in 197 countries.
After months of planning and millions of pounds of investment into sport, the Iraqi flag is flying at Athens. At the heart of the country's Olympic team is its footballers. The German Bernd Stanger was coach of the national football team until earlier this summer. He's a firm believer in the power of sport to make a difference in the embattled country.
After years of bad news from Iraq, wars,
embargo. It's good to have some good news, and it's amazing which result we have achieved after the war, straight after the war. Nobody can imagine how hard it was to make training sessions without water, no equipment, not security, absolutely nothing. But it's not new in the world. After the World War II, the Germans won the World Cup. They are world champion 1952 with passion, with commitment, and we try to go the same way. It's very, very important to have good results. But sometimes I believe people, if they switch on a TV and they watch a game and they forget completely under which hard circumstances we have to achieve such results. We can do more with our sport than diplomats in many, many meetings.
For the Iraqis walking into the Olympic Stadium in Athens, the principle of the modern Olympics, it's not the winning but the taking part, really does ring true.
Olympic Stories was presented by Diane Modal and produced by Rebecca Sandals. The programme was first broadcast in 2004. In our final Olympic story next week, Diane travels to Bahrain to meet the youngest athlete to take part in the Sydney Olympics. Far from being a child sporting prodigy, she'd never competed before the Games. Olympic Stories was an all-out production for BBC Radio 4. In just a moment on FM, we're off to Venus and Saturn in our series The Planets. But you might have heard that there's a cricket series currently being played out on English soil with a small matter of a very small trophy to be won. The Ashes reaches its climax starting very shortly. Test Match Special will be bringing you live action from the Oval on 198 Longwave, and that'll be here on Radio 4 after 10 o'clock. But before that on Longwave, on digital radio as well, it's time for the Daily Service. It's led by the Reverend Brian Hames. Here on FM, our book of the week, The Planets by Dalva Sobel. We preach